I am recording. And welcome everyone to the third of our speaker series about the history and natural resources of the Ozarks. My name is Todd Wilkinson. I am the project manager for the James River Basin Partnership. Glad to have you with us this evening. We're in for a treat as our executive director, Brent Stock, is giving a presentation on the history of recreation in the Ozarks. It's a very detailed and interesting presentation. So without further eloquence, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brent. We'll get him started. And again, if you have any questions, we'll type those in the chat box and ask them at the end of the presentation. Brent, it's all yours.
All right, guys, good evening. I appreciate you guys tuning in tonight. I have a presentation that I've really enjoyed researching. It's something that I've been interested in for a while, and this gave me the perfect opportunity to dive on in. So as Todd mentioned, I'm going to talk about recreation in the Ozarks, specifically with our Ozark streams in Southwest Missouri and the Upper White River region. I'll talk a little bit about some of the Big Springs region of the Ozarks over like the current Jack's Fork, 11 Point. I'll pull that in a little bit. I'm very aware that there's a lot of float trip culture in other parts of the Ozarks and other forms of recreation related to our streams. Some examples of like Ponce de Leon or some of the mineral springs. But for this, we're mostly going to focus on the Upper White River region, James River, Upper and Lower White. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we've got a PowerPoint that's very heavy with pictures that I think you all will really enjoy. So I'm going to switch over to that. And tonight, I've got a lot of slides to go through, so I'm going to be moving pretty quick. As Todd mentioned, if you guys have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. Todd will moderate that for us, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end to answer those questions. So again, we'll start the presentation. I chose the title John, Jim, and the James. John boats, Jim Owens, and the James River. Three things I'm really interested in, and then recreation on our Ozark streams. A little bit about me. So I actually grew up east of Kansas City, well, just east of Independence, Missouri. You know, up that way, there's not a lot of river recreation unless you're going out on the Missouri River. Most folks are on the water recreation is on local lakes. But I got really into bass fishing in high school and into my early college years. Any farm pond, any little stream that I could find that would hold largemouth, any neighborhood lake I could sneak into, I was doing it. I was chasing bass around all over the place. And I won't lie, that definitely influenced my choice of colleges. So I decided to come down to Missouri State because I knew there was good fishing in the region. And just like most people, I had heard that the Ozarks was this recreational playground. We had been coming down to Table Rock for years as I grew up. So I just kind of knew a little bit about the region. Knew I wanted to fish down there, decided it looked like a good school. So that's what brought me down here. I have a degree in wildlife conservation and management from Missouri State University. And after that, I've been kind of working with families and children in different forms of science and outdoor education. That brought me over to the James River Basin Partnership. I've been here for over 5 years now. Started out as project manager and then worked up into the executive director role at the beginning of 2020. So just wrapped up my first year as director, so survived. But moving on from that, the Ozarks, you know, it's a wide bioregion. Goes into portions of Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and even a little tiny bit of Kansas. But for today's presentation, we're going to focus on that southwestern corner of the state. Again, that Upper White River region, mostly on the James and Upper White River. So I'll start out early. You know, obviously there was Native American influence in the area. A lot of folks were living off the land prior to the Civil War. As we learned about in Bob Kipfer's presentation last time, we had folks when Schoolcraft made their way through that were living off the land, hunting, fishing, trapping, just living a subsistence lifestyle. But prior to the Civil War, Nathan Boone and early settlers, they found this region really attractive. Obviously, it was pretty remote at the time, limited agricultural possibilities if you're at all familiar with our soils. And people had to be pretty self-reliant and live off the land. Obviously the country had some major changes as we went through the Civil War. I'm going to kind of zoom through that time period a little bit, but following the Civil War, Railroads really brought folks to the Ozarks. That difficult terrain, again, that hampered early road building. So there just wasn't great ways to get around, just limited roads and accesses. We had small blue collar communities that began to spring up after the war, full of self-reliant folks that were just really gritty. In the late 1800s, the Ozarks really gained a reputation as a sportsman's paradise, and it's continued to have that reputation up until today. Railroad access improved in the late 1870s and 80s. And with that railroad access, we saw an increase in visitors from other regions. This brought more sportsmen to the region. Private lodges began to pop up, catering to sportsmen from Kansas City, St. Louis, and even as far as Chicago. Extraction industries like timber, mining, and market hunting began to kind of take their toll on the landscape. As we move to the early 1900s into the 1920s, one of the big things that took place that most folks around here know about is the publishing of Harold Bell Wright's best-selling novel Shepherd of the Hills. That drew a lot of attention to the region, and even still today, we see attention for attractions related to those things. Also, we saw a big push to bring more people to settle down in the region. A lot of the buzzwords they were using back then are things that we still hear today: recreation, opportunity, beauty, friendly people. That was all in play at that time. Let's see, in the early years of the 20th century, we really saw the detrimental effects of that increased access to our wild landscape. Railroads, they really start to attribute to the decline in wildlife resources. As you can see in the photos, timber harvest really started to take off. Again, we saw an increase in mining. The photo that you'll see there on the right is actually from one of the Pearson Creek mines just outside of Springfield. We also began to see sportsmen concerned for wildlife populations, and that'll come into play a little later on. But as many people know, the Ozarks was the landscape changed quite a bit at the turn of the century, first few decades following 1900. Early 1900s also saw the invention of the Ford Model T. This is pretty significant for tourism across the country. Cars started to become more widely available in the teens and 20s. Also in the early 1900s, we saw the creation of Lake Taneycomo. The dam power site that you see there down in Forsyth still stands today. Power site dam was finished in 1913, and that ended up creating a 2,000-acre lake behind it. It was a private dam used for hydropower. So that's 25 miles below Branson, down in Forsyth. Many of us are familiar and spent plenty of time on Lake Taneycomo. I still, even in this region, there's people that don't know what Taneycomo stands for. A lot of people think it's a Native American term. Taneycomo is simply Taney County, Missouri. They didn't get too creative with the name, really. But it became a very popular fishing destination for warm water species like bass and catfish. It also created its own tourism industry. Example of that is Rockaway Beach. And originally visitors would arrive by rail in Branson and take a boat ride down to the resort town. So it's pretty romantic way to make your way to a popular resort destination. So as we move on from that, we also see road improvements in the 1920s. And again, automobiles became more widely available. And throughout the 20s, we saw a travel boom. Automobiles really increased access to more remote regions of the Ozarks, increase in lodges and resorts catering to tourists. Railroad travel began to decline a bit as automobiles became more available. Folks that would arrive by rail typically stayed in one place longer, but if they arrived by car or roads or had access to a vehicle once they got to their destination, that allowed them to travel to more remote options. Oil companies began to take the opportunity to promote travel, and the Ozarks was high on their list for Midwestern families. And in the picture below, many of you guys are probably familiar with this, is the famous Y Bridge down in Galena. Many stories of this bridge, including stories of Bonnie and Clyde being chased across it. So you haven't seen it, it still stands today. It's open to foot traffic, but you can't drive across it anymore. Either way, it's a really neat view. So I'd encourage you, if you're in the area, to check that out. National sporting publications have always featured the Ozarks as one of their top destinations. Outdoor writers really promoted the region's scenery and rivers and wildlife. One great example of an early outdoor writer is Ozark Ripley. His original name, given name, is John Baptiste de Macaulay Thompson. So Ozark Ripley is a little easier to put into print. Famous outdoor writer of the time, traveled the world hunting and fishing and writing, and spent a lot of time with really prominent figures. Childhood memories of floats with his father on the 11-point and Current River were really what started him down his path. And that tended to be some of his most fond memories. Really a big fan of brownies, as he called them. Those are smallmouth bass. Loved to fish for smallmouth bass and goggle eye in the Ozarks. Regional publications also sprang up, not just national sporting publications. We had regional hook and bullet magazines, such as Missouri Game and Fish News and Ozarks Life Outdoors. Those two publications really promoted hunting and angling, and they also really pushed for policy reform and reforestation to protect wildlife habitat. So really, we saw some progressive mindset among sportsmen in the early part of the 1900s. As we move into the Great Depression, from about 1929 to the late 1930s, the whole country suffered through the Great Depression. The Ozarks were hit just as hard as everybody else. Some people came out of it ahead. Some people came out of it less scathed than others. We still saw the tourism industry in the Ozarks right in the heart of the Depression. You'll see Jim Owens opened his float trip service in Branson in 1935. But the Depression brought about a lot of changes. We saw a big time increase in government throughout the region. This was also kind of the start of that hillbilly era. Tourists viewed the local culture as raw and uneducated and backwoods. Controversially at the time, many residents promoted that idea, but that controversy still continues today. You could go on a whole nother slideshow about that, but we'll kind of leave that be for now. But following World War II, we saw an increase in disposable income and tourism, and that really prompted a huge increase of visitors visiting the Ozarks. So again, we talked about the concern from sportsmen about the degradation of wildlife populations and habitat. This spawned the creation of the Missouri Game and Fish Department in 1937, which we now know as the Missouri Department of Conservation. MDC, they're one of our first conservation agencies in the nation. They have a huge and wonderful legacy that continues on today. Game restocking programs started throughout the region at private preserves in areas like the Drury-Mincy area, just east of Branson. We also later helped other states restock wildlife populations. You can read wonderful stories about turkeys and deer being moved to other states to help restock regions that have been depleted through market hunting and lack of regulations. So really neat conservation history in our state, and something we should be proud of and make sure to protect in the future. As we kind of move forward, during the Great Depression era, we also see a lot of job creation through the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was something that was implemented by FDR. They worked a lot in national and state parks and employed a lot of people from urban areas and gave them many times their first exposure to more remote regions and forms of outdoor recreation. Many of the park structures that we enjoy today at areas like Bennett Springs, Roaring River, which you see pictured below, Sam A. Baker, and several other parks throughout the Ozarks. Many of those structures still stand today, and you can stay at the lodge at Roaring River. So really neat history there. Again, that's a whole nother slideshow you could do, but just really neat that we had that opportunity for folks to get them involved in the outdoors during such a weird time for the whole country, for the world for that matter. Moving on from that, we'll get into kind of the main discussion of tonight's presentation, and that's going to be the Owens Boat Line. This is something I've been fascinated with since I moved to the Ozarks. And I think many people are probably familiar with it. You see the pictures inside the White River Fish House down on the landing. You see pictures in Bass Pro. You see pictures in publications about the Ozarks all the time. And people hear the name Jim Owens, but they don't really know much about him. So I didn't either prior to this presentation. Really enjoyed the research. And there's all kinds of wonderful resources out there if you're willing to dig in, and I'll kind of share those at the end. But the two people you see pictured in the screen, the guy on the left in the longboat, that is Charlie Barnes, and the guy on the right, that's Jim Owens. So in 1935, Jim Owens, the guy with the bass over there on the right, he partnered with Charlie, and Charlie built the first set of boats for the Owens boat line. Charlie had been building boats on his own for a while, and he had a version of boats that he had seen used on the Current River, and then he adapted that design to fit the streams in the White River region and to accommodate multi-day floats. So Charlie, he had been in the float trip business for 29 years from about 1904 to 1933. That's when he got in contact with Jim, and they started the Owens float line. Charlie is said to have built more than 300 boats in his 4 decades of guiding, which I find just mind-blowing. I can't even imagine the work it would take to make one. And Charlie wasn't too fond of the term John boat. The term was really promoted by Ozark Ripley and another writer named Robert Page Lincoln, whom some of you may be familiar with. And really the name of John boat, spelled J-O-H-N or sometimes J-O-N, the origins are unknown. I did read that Lynn Morrow, he does suspect that it originated in the Deep South. There's several stories about somebody asking, well, what kind of boat is that? And a guy answered, well, it's John's boat. So there's all kinds of stories and rumors about how that name came to be. All I know is Charlie wasn't a big fan of it. Riders loved it. It brought a unique flavor to the craft and to the region, and it's something the Ozarks are famous for. As we move on, we'll talk about the big guy, Jim Owens. He really put Branson on the map as the float trip capital of the world. And this is something that he kind of stole a little bit of limelight from Galena. The famous floats on the James Fork of the White, going onto the Upper White from Galena all the way down to Branson. The trip's rumored to be over 120 miles. Really, we know it's less than that if we use modern mapping software. But regardless, they would put in at Galena and make their way down to Branson, and kind of the hub prior to Jim Owens was in Galena. But Jim put himself in Branson after his family had moved there, and really kind of stole the light from Galena a little bit, even though they obviously used them as a put-in. But Jim moved to Branson from Jefferson City. He moved here in 1930 when his father bought a drugstore. Jim was a busy guy throughout his lifetime. He was the mayor of Branson for many years. He was a bank president, a car dealer, a restaurant owner, a movie theater owner, even a dairyman. He wrote fishing and humor writing, foxhound breeder, dog food manufacturer. He kind of was a jack of all trades. Really, he was known for having a fat cigar or a pipe in his mouth, and he was really good at drawing attention to the Ozarks. So that's really what he's known best for. He made Ozark float fishing known throughout the country. He outfitted trips for Hollywood stars and dignitaries across the country that would come to the Ozarks, spend time with Jim. Some of those stories were featured in Life magazine, Outdoor Life, and Field and Stream, and other publications. He even boasted he could provide sportsmen with 31 days of fishing where they would never float the same water twice. I don't know if anybody ever took him up on that. A lot of times they had some pretty wild claims at this time, but we'll move on from there. The photo that you'll see is a colorized image from a group on Facebook. But really in the early days of Ozark float trips, boats were hauled back upstream by horse and wagon, or sometimes loaded on a train to get the boats back up to Galena. The Owens boat line actually used a couple of trucks and a trailer to carry their boats. So they were kind of more of the modern transportation for the time. Boats in the boat line, Owens boat line, were 20 feet long and constructed from pine lumber with metal ribs made from repurposed metal wagon rims. So those ribs you see, wrought iron bands going down the middle, came from wagon rims originally. I can only imagine what these boats would weigh, especially once they had kind of swelled up after spending time in the water. So pretty amazing, really. But the shorter boats, they decided anything shorter than 20 feet, they spun too much. Anything longer had a hard time in the wind. So 20 feet seemed to be just right. The center of these boats flared out a little more than the ends, and each end featured a little bit of rake in the nose and tail. Basically, nose rode up higher and the back end rode up higher, just to help them get over rocky shoals. Each boat also had a false bottom of unsecured lumber to keep gear dry. Again, these are wooden boats. Once they swelled up, after being in the water for a little bit, they became a little more watertight, but they pretty much always had a little bit of water on the bottom of the boat. Guides only paddled on one side of the boat, which I found really interesting. They typically did not swap sides. They would just feather the paddle to keep going straight. Most paddles were 6 feet long and made of ash, linden, or sassafras, which is known as a popular wood for paddles throughout the Ozarks. Boats hardly flipped like a canoe does. Instead, they would swamp and sink to the bottom. So you can only imagine what some kind of tragic event was like a sinking of a boat in the middle of one of their long float trips from Galena to Branson. Guides would sit in the back of the boat with two fishermen up front. In 1947, guides were paid about $6 a day plus tip. Many guides worked other jobs. It wasn't too common for a guide to just purely work for a float line. And a lot of these guides would work for Jim. They would work for the Galena Boat Company and several other companies throughout the region. The packing list for each trip is pretty extensive. And as you can see in the boat pictured below, they packed quite a bit of gear into these boats. Again, I would love to know what the actual weight of these things were. But for each trip, they would pack canvas tents for the guests, cook flies, bedrolls for guides and guests, sleeping cots for everyone, folding camp chairs, which they would sit in within the boat, as you can see kind of in the boat in the background, minnow traps, gas lanterns, an axe, a cook box, an ice box with a large block of ice wrapped in newspaper. Sometimes these blocks of ice were up to 200 pounds in the commissary boat. And depending on the length of the trip, most of the guide boats, the fishing boats, would have about 50-pound blocks of ice. So on one trip, depending on the number of people, you could have over 500 pounds of ice between all the boats, which was pretty incredible, really. They would pack all kinds of different beverages based on the client's wants and needs. And I found it pretty interesting, but in Ted Sayre's book, which I'll show you at the end, he mentioned they never took a stove with them. Everything was cooked over a campfire. Guests, they would sleep in tents, and guides would typically camp on their cots under the stars. Guides packed a raincoat, light jacket, hat, and inexpensive tennis shoes for wading. That was kind of their preferred shoe. Everything was provided for the guests except for tackle and hard alcohol. Jim ran a sporting goods shop, and I'm sure he sold plenty of lures. Each trip featured a commissary boat. The commissary boat was the lead guide of the trip, and it would float ahead of everyone. It'd be the first one to arrive on the gravel bar for lunch or for their camp for the evening, and it'd be the last one to leave. The commissary, he really took it upon himself to make all the meals for the group. The other guides would pitch in to help with meals as well. The first night, they always did either steak or chicken for dinner, and every night after that was fish. So somewhat limited menu after the first night, and that's again just room for fish that they were catching along the trip and just to keep things fresh. Probably couldn't keep chicken or steak well for very long. As far as sides go, they would include, for every dinner, they would have salad, French fries, canned vegetables, bread, butter, jelly, and canned fruit for dessert. For beverages, they would have coffee, beer, soda, or water, or if a guest wanted to pack hard alcohol, they could supply that as well. Breakfast was bacon, eggs, hot cakes, juice, or coffee. And lunch, they had sandwich fixins, pork and beans, and drinks. So pretty simple menu, but really for the time, that was probably pretty posh for gravel bar camping, especially the steak and chicken cooked over the fire. Each trip featured the White River Special, and I'll let you guys kind of think about what that might be. But basically, it had 4 legs and a shiny white seat on it, and it was set up on the back of a gravel bar. So that was actually their restroom they used for the trip. They would typically set it up behind camp in the brush, and the guide that tended to it when they were packing up camp would always threaten to forget it and leave it for the commissary. So just some joking and ribbing going on each trip, I'm sure. Nearly all of the fishing was done with artificial lures, casting rods, and level wind reels, just like what you see pictured there, somewhat similar to modern bait casting reel. Nobody had spinning reels yet. They just weren't, that technology wasn't really popular yet at the time. Kind of at the end of his float trip services when those started to become mainstream. Occasionally you'd see fly casters, but most of it was with casting gear. Fluke or Supreme was kind of the coveted reel amongst the guides and clients. Again, you can still sometimes see people on our Ozark streams using Fluke or Supreme reels, so pretty neat. Rods were either constructed of solid or tubular steel typically. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to fishing rods at the time as military antennas for military vehicles. And that's because most of these rod manufacturers during the war actually manufactured antennas as well. So it wasn't that the rods were being, the rods weren't repurposed to military antennas. It was just the same company was creating basically the same thing for, for Jeeps and other military vehicles. These rods were later replaced with fiberglass rods like you see pictured. And then a few of the common lures at the time, if you really, if you like to nerd out on some of these old historic fishing lures, there's a great museum in Branson called the History of Fishing Museum. I had a chance to visit there this week and kind of talk about some of these lures and the equipment and technology that was available at the time. Some of you guys may be familiar with some of the names that I'm about to list off. Things like jitterbugs are still available today. Creek chubs were very popular lures, as well as river runts. There was lures called hot shots, spooks, which are still made by Heddon today, very popular on Ozark streams. Chuggers, tiny torpedoes. I think we got Loring Bullard on here. That's one of his favorites. Whopper stoppers, which sounds pretty familiar to most modern anglers as the whopper plopper. Martin lizards, miracle minnows, hula divers, Clark poppers, scouts, pico perches, and bayou boogies. So all kinds of neat names, beautiful colors. I'll show you a few, again, that you can view at the History of Fishing Museum in Branson. If you're into this kind of stuff, I'd highly recommend visiting. Very neat place. This is an example of a crazy crawler, one of my favorite kind of retro lures to throw. Again, popular at the time. And many of the names, Whopper Stopper sounds really familiar, like I said earlier, to Whopper Plopper. A lot of this technology has just been repurposed with plastic, a little bit better finish than they used to have. So got them on the river runs. And as we move on from tackle, talking about the client's abilities, I thought it was really interesting. The guides mentioned that most of their clients were genuine sportsmen. I feel like anymore today, if you go on a guided trip, I'd say guides kind of get 50-50 between folks that are diehards and people that are new to it and want to experience something for the first time. But most of the clients back in the day were genuine sportsmen that knew their equipment, fished all over the continent. They had a lot of repeat clientele. The James itself was really known as one of the best bass streams in the country. It was known for some difficult spots with braided channels. I can think of a few places on the James like that right now. Guides always said you have to be really careful. If you couldn't see to the end of where channels split, sometimes you'd end up in a dead end and have to really push your way back upstream to make the corner and get in the right channel. Tricky shoals, they said the James had great smallmouth, not near as many line side bass as they called it. So they were referring to the largemouth and spotted bass or Kentuckies that we see in the stream. Still today, I think the James still favors more smallmouth than largemouth or Kentuckies. So stays pretty consistent with that. Always more goggle eye than any other stream. I thought that was an interesting note. Ted Sayre, he also said that they never saw smallmouth jump into the boat on any other river but the James. Apparently this happened several times. So fish literally flying into the boat. As people would make their way down from Galena on the James into the White River, right there at you can see kind of right in the middle of the map, right at the mouth of the James, things would open up as they got to the confluence with the White. The White River featured longer, wider holes, seemed to have more catfish than the James. Thought that was an interesting note. Trips to Branson would also typically stop at a place called the Acacia Club, which is about 4 miles above Branson. They would stop above Branson because Taneycomo backed the water up and it would just be a long, slow paddle. So they would take out, guides would then take their boats, typically with a motor that would be hauled down from the shuttle vehicle. They would tie boats together and motor them down to Branson where they would take out. Some notable mentions from Ted Sayre's writing. I thought some of the stories were excellent. If you can ever get your hands on a copy of his book, I would highly recommend it. Ted wrote a book called Some Recollections of a Ozarks Float Trip Guide, which I'll show you at the end. But some of his mentions, he mentioned that Jim was really generous with his walk-in freezer that he had at the shop. He would allow folks in town to store fish and game there. Some clients would request trips as long as 9 to 12 days, which is quite a long time to spend on the river. Here's a great picture of Jim's shop. I would love to just have an opportunity to see something like that. As far as keeping trips organized, Jim hired a guy specifically to run logistics for him. He was smart about hiring out people to make sure things happened. And sometimes they'd have to make trips in the middle of the night for emergencies to swap out equipment or meet somebody halfway. They did a great job keeping track of where everybody was at. He had many boats on the water at a time. And it's said that you could look across the James River Valley and see smoke from campfires from sometimes over a dozen camps. So that's pretty interesting. Let's see. White River guides. They would call heavy thunderstorms sow coons. Sow like a pig and coon like raccoon. Sow coon. I thought that was pretty interesting. I think maybe they got that as a spinoff of monsoon or something, but I'm gonna definitely implement that in my vocabulary going forward. Also, White River guides would communicate with each other using a barred owl call from one White River man to the other. So they could say you could be at a ball game. If you heard a barred owl call, you knew it was a White River guide. So that was pretty cool. Ted also mentioned that one time on a trip, he caught a 6-pound smallmouth on the lower White, which I thought was really impressive. I can't imagine catching a fish that big on an Ozark stream. So again, great picture of the guides of the Owens float line. Again, many of these guys work part-time, sometimes work for other guide companies as well, but just probably an unbelievable amount of river knowledge amongst the bunch. As we move into kind of more modern times, the 50s through the 70s, following World War II, that time period was greatly impacted by dams and highways. Big reservoirs created for flood control after floods during the Great Depression. That flood control really brought about the end of an era. Jim Owens quit his business in 1958 when Table Rock Dam put an end to floating below Galena. Jim and other outfitters throughout the region were really opposed to the large reservoirs, alongside many of the farmers who lost their land and homeowners that were displaced. Businessmen welcomed the change, kind of ushered in a new era of tourism. An interesting poem I found during my research, I'll show you here in just a second, kind of talks about the ending of an era after Table Rock Dam was built and float trips below Galena were no longer available. So this was written by a guide from Camp Rockhaven called Farewell, Beautiful James River. So I'm just an old broke down river rat. I have a story I want to tell, how they're fixing to ruin our beautiful stream. I'll tell you folks, it's hell. Now you can take old Mother Nature, she has done her work with care, and take man's beautiful pictures. You see that's nothing to compare. I know this old river like a book, almost every rock and tree, but I have been floating it for 40 odd years, you see. Many and many a night I've camped on her nice clean gravel bars, sleeping out in the wide open space beneath the bright shining stars. So come all you good fishers and float while you may. I hope to see you at Camp Rockhaven at the Fisherman's Hat Cafe. So I gotta imagine it was pretty sad and nostalgic for many of these longtime float guides. I can't imagine what it would be like to lose something that's been such a major part of your life. And it really makes me wish that I could go back and experience a trip on the James prior to the damming of the White. Just how awesome that must have been. Also, the You might have saw it in the notes earlier. Jim Owens passed away in 1972. He left behind a long legacy of work and promotion in the Branson area, major impact on the region. And that's why he's just so well known today. Just incredible guy. He'd be an interesting guy to hold some conversations with. Yeah, just a cool guy. And I hope to learn more about him following this presentation. But as we kind of move forward on the water, recreation really changed, of course, with the creation of the reservoirs. Recreation was widely available and became very commercialized. American attitudes towards nature changed during this time as well, and people began to kind of look forward to an easier life with more modern luxuries. Vacations were more about comfort rather than roughing it anymore. We began to see the beginnings of the environmental movement during this time period as well. In the 60s, we saw the protection of the Jacks Fork and Current rivers through the National Scenic Riverways. We also saw in the 70s, the Buffalo River was designated as National and Scenic to prevent damming. So environmental ethic was starting to really come to the forefront in the 70s especially. And we're pretty thankful for that today, people's foresight into reasons why we need to protect some of these wild places. As we look into the 1980s to present, I know there was quite a bit of change going on there as well, but I'm really kind of focusing on the water recreation for this. But during that time period, the Ozarks became really well known for family-friendly experiences. It wasn't just about hunting and fishing and camping and kind of that rough, gritty lifestyle. It became more about places that you could safely bring your family, find something for everyone. The region still caters to those seeking outdoor experiences of varying degrees. We have all kinds of different options available nowadays, from boutique to bed and breakfast options, formal campgrounds, backcountry gravel bar options if you're wanting them. We also have opportunities for those wishing to relocate. Northwest Arkansas is a great example of a rapidly growing community in the Ozarks. Springfield's said to be, full of future growth as well. We're in close proximity to wild landscapes, which is really appealing to a lot of folks coming to the region. And we have tons of recreational opportunities, whether you end up biking, birding, hiking, canoeing, anything outside, we have it available. So just again, kind of highlighting the different types of recreation available in our region. Today and into the future, the Ozarks, I think, will continue to be known as a family-friendly place for outdoor experiences. Again, we offer a little bit of something for everyone. We work to preserve that rustic and nostalgia of, that nostalgic feel. Bass Pro is a great example of somebody working to maintain that and keep that in the image of the Ozarks. Tourists can still rough it if they want to. We've got all kinds of state parks and national forests available, including several wilderness areas and plenty of public land to enjoy. We've really seen a renewed push for authentic, native, and unaltered experiences in nature. So that kind of comes with the modern day public land movement. Native fish become really popular. Kind of the locavore attitude, and folks seeking a DIY experience are really enjoying outdoor experiences nowadays in the Ozarks. We see a lot of educated, enthusiastic guides as well. They're definitely needed. Groups like 37 North are a great example. We need those people to help newcomers to overcome some of the intimidating learning curve that can kind of be out there with some of these outdoor recreation pursuits. The internet and social media and travel culture in general have really helped to hurt, in a way, expose some of our hidden gems. It's hard to find places off the beaten path anymore. It's harder to avoid crowds unless you're willing to burn some boot leather, or get out on the weekends, or take advantage of off seasons. Like right now would be a great time to paddle. But as frustrating as this can be for us as locals, we really need to recognize the benefits of tourism and the opportunities for education that it presents. So that's something we've really worked to embrace, especially in 2020 here at JRBP. We offered a handful of experiences for folks to get outside during the pandemic in a safe atmosphere where we were still social distanced, and gave people an opportunity to recreate and learn along the way. So COVID really brought a lot of people outside, saw a lot of utilization of our public lands and waterways. Outdoor equipment was just flying off the shelves. You couldn't find fishing line or fishing lures anywhere if you wanted it. We saw a lot more people taking staycations and really enjoying uh, outdoor experiences out in their own backyards. That was really neat. So again, awesome opportunity for us to tie in recreation with education. We're thankful for opportunities with the city of Springfield, our partners at Springfield Green County Parks, outdoor initiatives, Ozark, Nixa, you name it. All of our partners have been great about helping us to create outdoor recreation opportunities for folks in Southwest Missouri. I think going forward, we just really need to realize that we do have an active community here in the Ozarks. People are drawn to our waterways for all kinds of reasons. They're not all going to be the same, but they typically revolve around recreation. Many people agree that we need to protect our waterways, but they don't really know how or what that means. They don't know what it takes to protect our waterways. So we need to educate them about the opportunities that they have at home and ways that they can use their voice to provide protection for our places that we love and cherish. We also need to find ways to reach people outside of the classroom, meeting them where they're at and providing them with opportunities they may have never had before. So again, that's where experienced guides and people that are accepting people with open arms to our outdoor places. We need more of that in the future. We also need to keep an eye on the calendar for 2021. I think we're going to have some really neat events that we're excited to share with you guys. And we really hope that you can join us for some on the water events. And I just think that we're set to really see an explosion in recreation over the next few years. And I hope that we can really capitalize on that and create kind of the next generation of water warriors and recruit more of a constituency around our local waterways. So that's it for tonight's presentation. My email address is available. It's brentonstock@jamesriverbasin.com. If anybody has any questions that we don't cover tonight, feel free to shoot me an email. I'll have Todd put that in the comments section as well. But we're at a great place. I think we've got about 15 minutes. We can take some questions if anybody has any. But other than that, I just really appreciate you guys joining me for tonight's presentation. I know it was a kind of a fast one. I went through quite a bit of stuff. Hopefully I didn't mess anything up too bad. But again, fire away with your questions in the chat box and we'll see if we can get to those.
Looks like we've got one question, Brent, from Loring. Were there any legal limits on bass in the 1930s?
I didn't look into that. So I thought it was pretty interesting, the guides on the White River. Ted Sayre noted in his book, which I'll show you guys here real quick. Loring lent this to me earlier. So this is some recollections of a Ozarks float trip guide by Ted Sayre. He worked for the Owens Boat Line. He did mention that many of the guides were really on board with conservation of natural resources. They realized that these bass were their livelihood. These rivers were important to their bottom line, to their dollars that were lining their pockets. So they really took care of them. They did not like it when clients would come in and just fill a big stringer for a picture at the end of the float. They didn't want people to take home more than they could eat. So that was pretty interesting. I'm sure that there was eventually some legal length limits and creel limits involved, but I didn't really research that, Loring.
Hey Brent, why don't you tell everybody about the Kings River experience? That's another great story.
Kings River. Oh, yeah. Okay. So in Ted's book, he would kind of talk about each river and how each stretch of stream had its own different qualities. He talked about the James being a great smallmouth stream, not being too terribly difficult, but having some tricky holes. The Kings River was a notably difficult stream along with the Buffalo, which they would guide on occasion. They didn't just stick to the James River Upper White region. They would go down into Arkansas and other parts of Missouri. But the Kings River was one that the guides, especially new guides, were always a little nervous about during their first trip. And Ted, on his first trip to the Kings, asked an older guide, is it really as bad as they make it sound? And he's like, son, it is a wildcat with bells on, which I thought was pretty fun. So lots of good sayings. You should just read the book just for the sayings and the dialect. I think it's a lot of fun.
Let's see, we've got a message from Joe Fry. Thanks, Brent. Enjoyed it. And Loring says, great job, Brent.
Thanks, Loring. Guys, anybody else have any questions? Some great resources if you're interested in learning. Again, Ted Sayre's book, Ozarks Float Trip Guide, Recollections of an Ozarks Float Trip Guide. I've never seen this anywhere. Loring provided me with a copy. If anybody has a copy kicking around that they don't want, I'll happily take it off their hands. Also, the Paytons, Leland and Crystal Payton, they kind of literally wrote the book on the James Fork of the White. It's an excellent resource. If you don't have this in your library at home, I would highly recommend it. Any and everything you could ever want to know about the James Rivers on there. Also, an awesome book from the Paytons as well is See the Ozarks. This highlights all different types of tourism throughout the Ozarks, both Arkansas and Missouri, not just on the James and Upper White River region. So really neat publications that I'd highly recommend checking out. Also, I got a lot of information from the History of Fishing Museum in Branson. I want to thank those guys for letting me, kind of bend their ear, as well as the Branson Centennial Museum. Awesome files of Jim Owen's memorabilia, great displays, just really great resources.
Several more questions have come in now, Brent. First from Heather and Jeremy Blades. When did women start participating in the floats?
Okay, so originally, especially early in the 1900s, it was almost an all-male affair. It just kind of was a boys' club, really, especially with some of the early clubhouses on the James, like the Molly Joggers are a great example of that. I think around the 20s is when we started to see more women joining the long float trips. There was definitely a lot of women that took part in the Owens float trips for the Owens boat line. Many of the pictures featured both men and women. Things became more family friendly and more open to everyone. Probably in about the teens and 20s is what I would guess.
Denise and Brian Vaughn ask if they gigged on float trips.
Yes, so gigging has been a popular Ozarks pastime well before Jim Owen's era. There's all kinds of neat history about that, especially in the current river region, but it was also popular on the James and White, gigging for suckers, which you can still do today. Many people regarded sucker and continue to regard sucker as one of the best tasting fish. If you've never eaten a sucker, it's typically, you gig it and then you score it with a fillet knife. Some people have some pretty wild looking contraptions they use as well, but you score it really closely and you throw the whole fish in to be fried whole, gutted before then. So you fry the whole fish, that dissolves the bones down, and you can just eat this wonderful, wonderful meal. Yeah, it was popular. I think that Jim's guides did do some guided gigging trips, but really it was bait casting, fly casting trips that were kind of the most popular.
Just some more comments coming in. This was great. Thanks. The Kipfers say very interesting. Well done. And Brent Bulliard says, thanks, Brent. Watched this with the family that just moved here from Ohio. The history was all new to us. So
awesome.
The spirit of Jim Owen lives on there.
And guys, like I mentioned, this is just the James and the Upper White. There was all kinds of history throughout the Ozarks with tourism on our Ozark streams. The Current River and Jack's Fork, that region, especially with timber harvest, is really interesting. And that landscape itself has a ton of unique history. The Elk River's got a float fishing history. You get over around the Merrimack and its tributaries, there's a ton of great history there as well. And then, of course, Arkansas and even Oklahoma, they've got some really neat stories. People, their own Jim Owens of their regions. And it's something that I'd love to dig a little deeper into someday. All kinds of neat history out there. And the cool part is the same type of experience is still available for folks. If you want to go out there and camp on a gravel bar, if you want to gig suckers, if you want to go out there and catch tons of smallmouth bass, you can do that right here on the James, which is really cool. It's cool that we can still do those things.
Yeah, it's interesting. Heather just made a comment that this really should be shared with international students at MSU to give them an idea of those recreational opportunities. And this video, again, will be posted. I'll post it to YouTube tomorrow, and I'll send it out to all of the attendees that registered today, because I know some folks signed on late. Some folks may have missed it for whatever reasons. It'll go to you guys first. We'll put it out to the members and to the general public after next month. So what we're trying to do is have these be member events first, and then about a month later, we'll just open it up on YouTube for anybody to watch, so anybody can go back and see that. And in case you're wondering what's coming up next, I'll go ahead and put in a shameless plug for the next presentation, which is my presentation, and it's entitled Delaware Town, the Confluence of Early Ozarks History. So if you've ever driven by Delaware Town Access, or you put in at Delaware Town Access and wondered what Delaware Town was, we're going to talk a little bit about the early history of the James River Basin and the settlements and transportation use of the river, and some things you may not have known about in the early history of the Ozarks.
Yeah, that'll be a treat. I am really looking forward to that. I've been interested in some of that history for a long time. Todd is a wealth of knowledge and that kind of thing. So I think you guys will be in for it. It'll be a really neat presentation.
Any other questions?
Guys, one other thing I do want to mention, I failed to mention this earlier. John boat trips on the James River, that wasn't all about tourism. Folks were using wooden John boats on the James and other Ozark streams long before Jim Owen's float line came into play. Jim just really popularized the float fishing scene, but many folks, many locals spent many nights out on the James and other Ozark streams, gigging, catching fish, doing gravel bar campouts. This wasn't new. It just got popularized by Jim Owens.
Dates and time for Delaware, please. That is, just let me double check my dates here. I don't want to tell anybody wrong. We're trying to keep them to the third Thursdays of the month. And of course, at 6 p.m., we're keeping that time as well. So it looks like the 18th of February at 6 p.m. will be the Delaware Town presentation. And I'll be sending out reminders about that. We'll post that on Facebook and on the JRBP website. And we'll also put something out in our e-newsletter, The Current. If you're not a subscriber, you can subscribe on our website, jamesriverbasin.com.
Guys, thank you so much for letting me talk your ear off tonight. I know
Great
I kind of
job,
sped
Brent.
through some of that stuff. If anybody wants to see any other pictures or have any other questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Again, it's Brenton, BRENTON, Stock, STOCK, at jamesriverbasin.com. Thanks, guys.
All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and sign off. Have a good evening, stay safe, and we'll see you next month.